The year is 2008. Lenders are on pace to initiate 2.25 million foreclosures. Banks begin to fail. Entire neighborhoods go dark. And millions of people who thought they were financially secure realized their stability was thinner than they ever imagined. People didn't lose their houses because they rented. They lost them because they bought more house than their income could support. Most of them ignored one simple rule. The fastest way to stay broke in America is not renting. It's buying a house you can't afford and pretending it's an investment. Most people think housing is about stability. It's not. Housing is about identity. It's where ego meets money. People buy homes to prove they made it, to match their coworkers, to show their parents they're doing fine, to feel like real adults. None of those reasons appear on a balance sheet. All of them show up in your bank account. And here's the uncomfortable part. Your brain is wired to justify big decisions after you make them. Once you picture yourself in that house, you stop asking whether it's smart and start asking how to make it work. That's not finance, that's psychology. There's a simple rule that predicts whether your housing choice builds wealth or quietly drains it. It's called the 30% rule. Banks ignore it. Realtors hate it. Buyers negotiate with it like it's optional. Today, I'll show you why this rule matters more than interest rates, why renting isn't the villain, and how one boring percentage quietly decides your financial future. Because housing doesn't just give you somewhere to live, it decides how rich you get. For decades, we've been fed one sentence like it's financial wisdom carved in stone. Renting is throwing money away. Sounds responsible, feels mature, completely ignores reality. Housing is not a moral decision, it's a math decision. Buying can build wealth. That part is true. Buying at the wrong price destroys wealth faster than renting ever could. Most people do not buy homes because it makes financial sense. They buy because it makes social sense. You see coworkers buying, friends posting keys on Instagram, parents asking when you're going to settle down. Suddenly renting feels like you're falling behind in life, not just housing. There's a psychological effect here. Humans anchor their status to visible signals. Cars, homes, neighborhoods, school districts. The house becomes a symbol of progress, not a financial tool. People don't compare their housing costs to their income. They compare their house to someone else's house. The protagonist in Fight Club said it perfectly when he described his life as buying furniture and identities he didn't need. The things you own end up owning you. That line hits harder when your thing is a 30-year mortgage. And here's the subtle trap. Nobody feels irresponsible buying a house. It feels adult, responsible, stable. That emotional safety makes people ignore the math. Banks reinforce this pressure. They approve you based on what you can technically pay. They never ask whether paying that amount will wreck your long-term finances. Approval is not advice. It's risk transfer. The bank gets paid whether you thrive or drown. Their incentive is volume, not your financial health. They run algorithms on your debt to income ratio and employment history. They don't measure your stress tolerance or retirement goals. So people stretch, they justify, they buy more house than they should. And that is where financial stress lives. Not in renting, not in owning, in overspending. I've seen people rationalize 45% of their income going to housing because the neighborhood felt right, because their salary might increase, because they didn't want to miss out. None of those reasons protect you when the furnace dies in January. Before we even talk about rent versus buy, we need to talk about the rule that separates stability from slow motion financial disaster. The rule is simple. Your total housing cost should not exceed 30% of your gross income. Not the mortgage alone. Everything. Mortgage, property taxes, insurance, maintenance, repairs, HOA fees, the new water heater that fails the week after you move in, the roof that leaks during the first winter, all of it counts. This rule did not come from bloggers or TikTok. It comes from decades of housing and economic research. HUD classifies a household as cost-burdened Once housing costs exceed 30% of income, and that standard is widely used to flag affordability risk. Once housing takes too much of your income, something else gets sacrificed. Emergency funds disappear, retirement contributions shrink, investments stop. And what most people miss is that the damage is quiet. Nothing explodes immediately. You just slowly lose your ability to build wealth. Your house stops being shelter and starts being a financial vacuum. You are not building wealth. You are servicing a lifestyle. The math is boring. That's why it works. Here's what 30% actually looks like. If you make $70,000 a year gross, that's about $5,800 a month before taxes. 30% is $1,750. That needs to cover your mortgage, property tax, homeowner's insurance, repairs, and the occasional surprise expense that every house delivers on schedule. Most people look at that number and think it's too restrictive. It's not restrictive, it's realistic. The other 70% of your income has to cover food, transportation, healthcare, childcare, utilities, debt payments, retirement contributions, and the emergency fund you're supposed to be building. 30% leaves room to live. 45% leaves room to survive. The rule is this simple. Why do people ignore it every single day? Because emotion beats math every time. People do not shop for homes with spreadsheets. They shop with imagination. They picture dinner parties in a bigger kitchen, kids in a better school district, a backyard that finally feels like success. Then they look at the monthly payment and think, I can stretch for this. I once talked to a couple who did exactly that. They bought the house that felt like success, bigger kitchen, better school district, nicer neighborhood. The payment was tight but manageable on paper. Within 2 years, they stopped investing. Within 4 years, they were living paycheck to paycheck. Within 6 years, they couldn't move, couldn't change jobs, couldn't breathe financially. Nothing dramatic happened. No crash, no emergency. The house just quietly ate their margin. That's how this usually works. Not with explosions, with slow suffocation. Stretching is where the story turns. Like a renovation starts small and triples in cost. Anyone who has ever touched a house knows this. You plan for $10,000, it becomes $30,000. Then you discover electrical problems, plumbing issues, structural surprises. Houses hide problems like old cars. A friend of mine bought a charming older home in a neighborhood he loved. 3 months in, the inspector missed foundation issues became impossible to ignore. $12,000 later, he was draining his emergency fund just to keep the house standing. He didn't lose the house. He lost 5 years of investing momentum. People also stretch because they want to live where they think they belong, not where they can afford to be. Status inflation hits housing harder than anything else. Nobody brags about the house they can easily afford. Banks help you stretch. Realtors normalize stretching. Friends validate stretching. And people convince themselves future raises will fix today's overspending. That's optimism bias in action. You assume tomorrow's income without accounting for tomorrow's expenses. Kids get more expensive, healthcare costs climb, cars break, parents age. The future income you're counting on to cover today's stretch rarely arrives without bringing new costs with it. Here's the thing most people forget. We already ran this experiment once. Millions of Americans bought homes they technically qualified for, but financially couldn't sustain. Banks approved loans based on optimistic math. Buyers assumed prices would keep rising. Everyone believed housing was safe. Then reality showed up in 2008. When income stalled and rates adjusted, housing costs stopped being manageable. People weren't failing because they rented, they were failing because they owned too much house with no margin. Foreclosures didn't happen because people didn't value homeownership. They happened because the numbers never worked in the first place. The lesson from 2008 wasn't don't buy homes. The lesson was simple. When housing stretches your budget, it stops being security and becomes risk. And here's the part nobody wants to hear. That lesson isn't old, it's current. Today, housing affordability is still brutal in a lot of places. Payments are high, prices are high, rents are high. People tell themselves this is the new normal. They tell themselves they have to stretch or they will never own. They tell themselves their income will catch up. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but the math doesn't care what the market is doing. The math only cares about your cash flow. That's how people become house rich and life poor. The mortgage looks manageable on paper. The hidden cost is lost investing time. Every extra dollar trapped in housing is a dollar not compounding somewhere else. And that is exactly where renting quietly wins more often than people expect. Renting wins when it protects your investing power. If renting keeps your housing at 25% of your income while buying pushes it to 45, the renter often builds more wealth over time. Here's what that actually means in real numbers. If your housing costs just $700 more per month than they should, that's $8,400 a year. Invested consistently for 30 years at average market returns, that's well over $500,000. Suddenly, this isn't about rent versus buy. It's about whether your house is quietly costing you retirement. $500 invested monthly for 30 years can become hundreds of thousands of dollars. That same $500 absorbed by a larger mortgage simply disappears into consumption. Money in the market grows exponentially over decades. Money trapped in a house grows linearly and often unpredictably. Let me make this painfully simple with two people. Person A buys the maximum house the bank approves. Housing takes 45% of income. Investing becomes optional. Some months it happens, most months it doesn't. Repairs get paid with stress and credit cards. Any life change feels like a threat. Person B rents a modest place. Housing stays around 25%. Investing is automatic. Every month, the difference goes into index funds, not because person B is smarter, because person B has margin. 15 years later, person A has a house and a lot of obligations. Some equity, maybe, but little liquidity. Moving is hard. Changing jobs is hard. Taking risks is hard. Person B has options, a portfolio, liquidity, the ability to move for a better job, the ability to handle emergencies without panic, the ability to buy later if it makes sense. This is why renting can win. The psychology of money explains this idea in plain terms. Wealth is not about owning impressive things, it's about maintaining flexibility and letting compounding work for you. Homeowners trade flexibility for stability. That trade works when stability is what you need, it backfires when you need to adapt, and you're locked into a 30-year obligation. This is not an argument against buying. Buying can still be powerful, but only if it follows the rule. Buying works when it stabilizes your costs and keeps you inside your margin. A modest home you can comfortably afford turns housing into a predictable expense instead of a financial gamble. Predictability is underrated. When your housing cost is stable and manageable, you can plan, you can invest, you can build reserves, you can make decisions without fear. The Federal Reserve's survey of consumer finances makes one thing obvious. Families that build wealth usually do it by consistently owning assets and investing over time, not by maxing out housing. The difference is not ownership. The difference is margin. When you look at wealthy households, something interesting shows up. They rarely buy the biggest house they can afford. They buy the house that leaves them room to invest, room to adapt, room to survive bad years. They automate investing before upgrading lifestyle. They protect liquidity instead of chasing appearances. They don't try to look rich, they try to stay rich. Buying also makes sense when rental markets are unstable or expensive relative to ownership costs. In some cities, renting a comparable property costs more than owning. In those cases, buying under the 30% rule becomes the smarter play. But notice the condition. Under the rule, not stretched, not justified, comfortable. If you buy and still have room to invest, save and live, ownership becomes a tool. If buying kills your flexibility, it becomes a trap. Wealth does not come from owning a house. It comes from what your budget allows you to do after paying for it. So the real question is not rent or buy. The real question is simpler. Does this housing decision keep me under 30% in investing consistently? If yes, either option can work. If no, both options can ruin you. Money does not disappear. You spend it. Housing is where most people overspend for decades because the purchase feels permanent and responsible. Nobody feels irresponsible signing a mortgage. That's exactly why it's dangerous. If your house eats your margin, your future shrinks. If your housing stays controlled, your future expands. Keep housing reasonable, invest the difference. Repeat for years. This isn't exciting, that's why it works. Here is the practical test. No debate, no ego. If your housing cost forces you to reduce investing, pause. If your housing cost depends on future raises to feel comfortable, pause. If your housing cost pushes you into credit card debt for repairs, pause. If your housing cost still leaves room for investing, saving, and a normal life, then you are probably fine. This is what the 30% rule really is. It's a margin test. Margin is what keeps you calm when life happens. The real mistake isn't renting. The real mistake isn't buying. The real mistake is letting your house decide your financial future. Because where you live should support your life, not control it. If you remember one thing from this video, make it this. Housing should support your wealth, not replace it. Stay under 30%. Invest the difference. And if you want to see what actually builds wealth after housing costs, click the video on your screen now. In that one, I break down the single habit that separates the wealthy from everyone else. Do the boring stuff, it works.